Okay, welcome back to this week's podcast. It's great as ever to have episodes with guests on board, especially guests that have got a sales history and credentials that are impeccable and know so many things about so much to do around the sales world that we all live in. And I'm really proud that Kristie has joined us. She is a best-selling author. She's a founder of her company, Sales Accelerator Group. She's an expert in helping salespeople build lots of skills and accountability and discipline around selling. So welcome to the podcast, Kristie. Lovely to have you here.
James, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, and I was going to let you do a bit of an introduction as to who you are, but I was intrigued by Mike Weinberg did a forward on your book. So obviously Mike's a great sales guru as well. I'm guessing someone you know, and his book is, if your book is, I'm sure, a wonderful book like Mike's book. What I'm intrigued, before we get into the elements of getting to know, we'll get to know you first, then we'll talk a bit about the connection with Mike. Tell people that don't know you a bit more about your background and how long you've been in sales and how long you've been doing what you've been doing.
Sure. I grew up in a sales household. So my parents owned a real estate company and my father was the owner broker and my mom was a top sales real estate agent. And then I transitioned that so I was in, most of my jobs in high school and college were sales related. And then out of college, I went into retail. So I worked in a department store for a couple of years before going to the buying offices. And then I spent 8 years in retail sales before going into B2B SaaS sales. So I spent the last 25 years in B2B SaaS, 10 years of that owning my own company and working with small and mid-sized companies, helping them build out their sales processes, do some sales coaching, help them hire top talent. And then doing some executive coaching as well. So I think the growing up in a small business household helped me find a really soft spot in my heart for those who are small business owners as well as running that type of organization. So I love what I do.
So your mum and dad were in sales. So who did you learn most from then?
I took the path my dad went down. So initially I took the sales leadership path. I had a younger brother and he took the individual contributor path. So we each went down the sales path, but in different directions.
But I mean, one of the things I always talk to people about, sales experts like yourself who've been in the business, by the way, we'll dig into the B2B SaaS stuff because I wish I'd known you when I was building my SaaS business years ago. But one of the things I always talk about is sort of the learnings that you have from those people that we start from. And my dad was in sales and I learned a lot from him. Were there particular things that your dad, you remember now that they taught you at an early age, you thought, well, that really stuck with me or has served you well over the course of your career?
Yeah, it's funny. My parents were more modeling by doing than talking. So there was a lot of modeling in our house. We definitely saw work ethic. We saw problem solving. Even though my dad was home at night, my mom might be out getting contracts signed. The phone never seemed to stop ringing. So as the broker, when an agent had a problem, he became the problem solver. And so I was privy to a lot of conversations after hours, as well as we were sort of office rats. We kind of hung out at the office. But I think work ethic was the number one thing that I learned just by watching. Real estate is a thankless industry, if you ask me. The real estate agents are working when everybody else isn't working, right? So, you're doing your administrative things during the day, but then you're working with clients nights and weekends. So it really is a 50 to 80 hour a week job. So you have to, if you're not into working hard, this would not be the right place for you. And then I think the other thing that, real estate is a referral and repeat business. So in order to make sure that you got referrals from prior customers or those former customers came back as new customers, customer service, how you treated people, the relationships you had, honesty, fairness, those type of things were all modeled. That was very much, as you saw people come, every 5 to 10 years, someone might sell a house or buy a house, and the referrals were happening all the time. So the importance of how you treated people, if you do the right things, my Christieism is if you do the right things will happen. And I think that was modeled at a very early age.
It's such a good point around doing the right things, and also I always learn from I'm sure you have. We learn from greats like Zig Ziglar. If you're not selling a customer, you're not selling into a client. You're selling, you're buying a relationship into a customer over time, and it's about having those relationships that develop and build from there. I mean, but what's just on that point? I mean, when you look at obviously the real estate business, when you learn your skills in from your father and your mum, and when you sort of went into obviously other sales, what are some of the common things that you saw people do really well, the things that the real success stories that you saw that were great examples. But what were some of the mistakes that you saw people made that you thought, right, I need to learn from those? Because that sometimes I know in my sales career, that's the best way I've learned is from mistakes, right?
I mean, I think the learnings were some of the things I shared already, but some of the detriments, I mean, that was a 1099 business. And so although the real estate company gave you sales training and real estate training, you obviously had to pass a test, right? Nobody got to sell real estate unless they had passed the real estate bar, if you will. But I think like my mom spent a lot of time early on in what we called the phone duty room. And so back in the day, before the internet, the only way you could find out about a house is if you called the phone number that you saw on the sign. And so like she did her time, right? I mean, I think a lot of sales reps come in and think that they're going to, they want to jump into enterprise sales, or they want to, they're ready to sell, but they haven't done the work, right, to earn the right to have those type of sales. And so I remember her just sitting, I mean, like she didn't really have a lot of clients. My mother spent almost 14 years teaching school. So she was a former school teacher. And so she didn't have a lot of, contacts in the community, if you will. She wasn't a business person, and she taught for a rural school outside of town. So she spent a lot of time just prospecting, volunteering to do open houses for real estate agents that were too busy because they had, 3 or 4 listings and couldn't hold all of their homes open. So she would say, you don't even have to pay me. Like, I'll hold your open house open, just so she could meet people and learn. And she sat in that phone duty room and took inbound calls about houses for hours. So, that was one of those, like, you have to give your dues, pay your time, do your time, and start at the bottom and work your way up. And she also, she also spent time with some of the top agents. So she got mentors and made sure that she was mimicking. I mean, she saw what the top agents in town were doing, how they were marketing their business. And so, she invested a lot of money in marketing as well. And then education, right? Continuing education. That's a big part of it. That was sort of, again, like that was a have to do, that was mandatory in that industry. But I think it also, but my parents spent a lot of time at conferences, either locally or regionally, making sure that they got their continuing education credits, but also making sure that they learn from the best. So I think just there were so many learnings, so many positives. And then the people who failed, they weren't committed. They weren't willing to put in the time. They maybe had small children and didn't want to spend nights and weekends selling real estate. So it kind of goes back to a lot of things I talk about in the book, which is you have to know yourself before you get to know the prospect. And so if your lifestyle doesn't fit something like real estate, then you're probably going to struggle.
Yeah, and I think I want to dig into some of the things that you talk about a lot, because I know discipline and accountability and doing the work is something that you're sort of very big on. But going back to those sort of elements around challenges that a lot of people have, I think I don't know if it's something that you notice, but I certainly notice with people that maybe sort of started in career in sales, they do 6 months of grind. I mean, I did call in the UK here, it was called double glazing sales, right? Where we picked up, we had something called the yellow, the yellow pages in America. We used to call numbers from literally top to bottom, and $200 a day. That was the grind, right? And that was the part of the fun. And you got very few yeses, and mainly go aways and get rids. But the point being, it taught you good lessons to work. And do you think it feels to me sometimes that a lot of salespeople nowadays don't want to do that graft, or am I being harsh?
Nope, you're not being harsh. A lot of people don't want to do the work, right? I mean, that, like you said, the SDR role, people it's a burnout role. There's no doubt about it. I agree with that. But I mean, at the 18-month mark, they're like, oh my gosh, when am I going to get promoted already? And I'm like, you're going to work for 50 years, 40 or 50 years, you're going to work. And 18 months is nothing. That's such a small percentage of the total, professional career you're going to have. And with 18 months, they're like, what's next? Like, I am done.
Yeah. And it's a challenge as well, especially because modern day prospecting is changing. As you may know, I've got a sales calling business in Africa, South Africa. And one of the things I say to the guys is that, the calling model has changed a lot over time, right? The ability to engage with people is more challenging now than ever before, but it is still very doable. I mean, interesting enough, a lot of people think about calling being dead. A lot of people talk about calling me dead. I'm of the view, obviously, that it's very much alive. But I'm guessing you're of the same path, that there is still a huge opportunity to do things there.
Yeah, I say we don't sell anything over email, right? I mean, you can't really close a deal over email unless it's a transactional type situation where they can buy it on the website. And so, no, I mean, now where you enter, I think the thing I've seen over the years is the buyer now doesn't need our support as early on as they used to, right? The buyer's journey has changed. thanks to the internet, thanks to AI, thanks to all of those things. And so, we have to be listening, if you will, more closely for when the appropriate time is to come in and provide assistance, because they're getting so much further down the path on their own. And really, like, they're probably down to 2 or 3 vendors when they really want to enter a sales cycle. And at that point, want to talk, want to see, want to start to negotiate, versus using sales professionals as part of their research in the past. Now they're finding other ways to get the research done and really narrowing the field. So we have to understand that that's been a big change. I mean, when I started in sales, the internet didn't exist.
Yeah, and I guess it's obviously one of those things that, the reality is people, like you say, the buying decisions change. Years ago, you did face-to-face or house-to-house sales, you could go in and you could provide a brochure and, no one would go on and see whether your review site had got a Google review or whatever else. Whereas now, like you say, they're searching on you, they're looking at you, who you are before you start. But I still think the calling, when you call and talk about problems, still resonates. And I guess the question that when I chat to a lot of salespeople about it is, are you relevant to the buyer? A lot of the time you're not relevant. And I guess, what's your experience of that in terms of the way a lot of people are doing that type of outreach now? It feels to me as well that a lot of people get it badly wrong. And that's why a lot of people don't like sales, because they just seem to just be a scattergun or not really have a really focused approach to doing it.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's what goes back to that discipline, like work the process or the process won't work. Like as an example, I'm working with a client now who sells childcare software. And instead of just reaching out to decision makers, I've actually asked the team to reach out to influencers. So I'm having them go and get information from people who run a particular center. So we're looking for childcare organizations that have multiple locations. And so we're reaching out to the person running an individual location, or multiple center directors, as we call them. And I want to understand what's going on. Who are they? What vendors are they using? What problems do they personally have at that level? We are not trying to sell them anything. We're not even trying to get an appointment out of them. We're trying to catch them on the phone and just ask a few questions to get some information so that we can take a very custom and targeted approach to the decision maker. The fact of the matter is, in this industry, everybody is already using something. So all we're doing is stealing business from each other as vendors. But we need to understand what's working and what's not working so that we can come in and take a very targeted approach. So again, it requires a lot of research, but a lot of the research I'm asking them to do is not just on the website, which is a very helpful tool for us because parent apps and communications and things like that and how people sign into things are there, and we can get some information on that. But I'm trying to get some information from humans, the people who are maybe being directly impacted by that, the end user, before going up the chain and doing something more targeted.
No, I agree totally, and I think, like you say, that insight and that, I always use the phrase, get a PhD in your customers' problems, right? And if you can understand what their issues are and what their challenges are, and become helpful and valuable to them, people are open to having those conversations with you, I guess. Going back to, you obviously work with business owners and mixture. Why do people dislike sales? Why are we? Because as me and you are fine and proud of our craft, but so many people are we're a bit sort of dislike it. And is it because they think that people are too pushy? Is it because I say it's because I think a lot of people sell the wrong way. But what's your view of why we're as an industry we're seen as a bit like the devil sometimes, aren't we? Is that we're seen as this group of people everyone wants to avoid?
I think. As an industry, so I think there's a couple of things. One, I don't think there are a lot of professional sales reps out there anymore. People who, like you said, really know how to sell. They have been trained in the art of sales. I think now we've swung the pendulum since AI and data, and we're all relying on the science of sales. It's about the data, it's about the numbers, it's about how many calls and what your conversion rate is and what your contact rate is and what your close rate is. All of those things are important. And I'm not saying that they're not, because I believe that data don't lie. So, but I don't think sales leaders are providing the type of professional development and training in the soft side of sales, the soft skills, the art of sales, how to active listen, how to take, look for nonverbal cues when you're on Zoom, how to, handle objections. Most people still are handling objections by trying to talk their way out of them, which doesn't sound like anything but defensiveness. And so I don't think we have professional salespeople. Nobody does ride-alongs anymore. New people don't ride along with their sales professionals. I just hired 3 new reps for the childcare center software company. And I must have given them 12 hours worth of discovery and demo calls to listen to. right? And then if there were live calls when they first started in the first 3 or 4 weeks, I had them sit in with the senior reps, right? To try to do ride-alongs. I just don't think people, and I as the sales leader, used to do call monitoring. I would coach 2 calls a week. I would sit in on calls. I would give advice. I wouldn't necessarily be in to help close anything. I was really there for coaching purposes so that I could do some live coaching afterwards. I think that I don't see that much anymore from anybody. I think there's so many meetings, right? There's so many internal meetings that people are worried about getting their slide decks together for the board meeting with the executive teams, finance, we've lost the art of sales. So as a buyer, as a seller, I'm not as helpful as I used to be, right? I'm not even as good at my craft, right? I'm clunky. I'm not smooth. I'm not helpful. I'm not consultative. And so, if you're not helpful, I walked into a department store over the weekend. I had already decided, this is a very personal buying decision, but
it's good.
I have been using powder blush for my makeup, and I just didn't think it looked really natural. And so I started doing some research online about cream blushes. So by the time I walked into Nordstrom's, I already knew what I was looking for. And then I walked up to the counter, the MAC counter, and I said, I think you have 2 cream blushes. Can you show me them and tell me the difference? And can we, do some demoing on me? And, I happened to hit the jackpot because instead of getting the Nordstrom's MAC rep, I got the MAC rep. I got the woman who worked for MAC Cosmetics. And so she knew everything. In fact, she was wearing a cream blush. And so, 10 minutes later, I walked out with a cream blush and a lipstick. But I didn't go to her to say, tell me about the pros and cons of powder versus cream, right? I'd already made that decision. Now, had she said to me, well, what have you been using? And I said, well, powder. She would ask me, if she'd asked me why, if she was really doing consultative selling, she would have said, well, tell me why you're even thinking about switching. As your skin type changes, is it getting drier? I'm getting older, right? So, by the time, I don't think people really understand how to enter the sales cycle where meet the buyer where they are.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. And it goes back to a lot of things around, one of the things that I talk to a lot of salespeople about is you've got to be informed. Discovery has changed. So whereas before you were, discovery was a process where you would ask, questions that were pretty open and maybe to identify problems and challenges. I actually think most buyers now want you to know what their issues are before you start, and then be in a position where you can comment positively and proactively on those issues because you're a value added, salesperson to them. And if you're going in and asking, I talk about B2B software. I had a B2B software business, and we say if you're going in and talking to people about their problems or asking what are their problems, you've lost before you start.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think that it's what Sam, who's a consultant, says, show me you know me. And I say to sales reps, don't ask any questions that you can find on the internet, on their website, on their LinkedIn page. You should already know what the problems each of the personas you're reaching out to have. There's no reason to ask questions about things that you already know. And then we should be asking all the questions we don't know. The other thing I say is discovery is not an event. It's not a call. It's a process. Discovery happens all along the sales process at every stage along the way. You should be asking more questions and gathering more information so that you can be more helpful.
Yeah, agreed. Over your career, obviously, there's lots, there's loads of stuff I'd like to chat to you about, but I want to talk about the B2B sales and SaaS sales, but also the book in a moment. But over the, what are the critical skills that, you've developed over your time that you think made you really good at selling? It was, obviously you've learned lots, but was there 1 or 2 things that if someone was listening to this going, Kristie, okay, what's the one thing I should focus on, or the area that I should focus on that would, make me better at selling? What would, is there anything over your career that you think that's the critical thing?
I think understanding and accepting that not every prospect is a fit. And that you determine as the sales professional who's a fit and who isn't, right? So I define fit the following way. They have a problem. Your product or service can solve it. They want to solve it, because not always is that the case. They're willing to spend money to do so. And they're going to be willing to make a decision in X period of time, fill in the blank for your sales cycle, right? And so we can't decide for other people when they're going to purchase, right? We can amplify the problem and we can calculate it in dollars and cents and say, here's the financial impact this problem is having on your business, but I can't force them to buy, right? And so I think people understanding what fit really is and having discipline around saying, hey, I'm actually not sure you're ready for our product or service. I'm not sure this is the right time. I'm not sure you have enough money. I'm not sure you have someone who can actually implement this, or you're not in a position to implement this successfully. And so that requires, James, a full pipeline, right? Because you can push people away who are going to be stalled deals anyway, right? In SaaS, we're going to close. I mean, if we're lucky, we're going to close 1 in 5. We're probably going to close 1 in 6 or 1 in 7, which means the majority of people aren't going to close. The sooner we make that decision and share with them that we don't think this is the right timing or the right X for them, the better. And I think most people aren't willing to do that, because the difference here's what I say. There's a difference between somebody being ICP and being a fit. And I don't think most people understand the difference. You can look great again, I dated a lot of guys who looked great on paper, but most of those guys were not a fit.
It's a great point, and it's really interesting because when I think about the you mentioned there about the prospecting, and obviously one of the great things that I took from Mike's book was about being a prisoner of hope, and I was talking about that today with actually a client of mine, and about how most, like you say, most salespeople are in that position because their funnel's dry, right? Or their funnel. I talk about fat funnels a lot. Your funnel needs to be fat. It needs to be 3 or 4 times your target. And if you're not, and it happens because you haven't prospected enough, and because you haven't done the work, and you haven't gone out and done the, goes back to your graft and elements around it. But it's a really intriguing point. Just interested about the business to business SaaS sales. What got you into doing that? Was there a particular part of your career that made you made that jump? And how have you found that? Because obviously I remember, and I'm going to tell you a quick story before it involved me a sec, because I set up a SaaS business in 2005, a SaaS CRM business. And I remember talking to the guy that set up Salesforce in Europe, and he was, he said at the time we were selling religion as well as selling the Bible. And it's funny, and how now 20 years later, SaaS is obviously what everyone's doing. But tell me, what got you into that and that journey? I'd be interested to, for people to share that, and how has it affected you in terms of the way you approach your selling?
Yeah. I went from retail, so being a buyer at a major department store, to working for a B2B SaaS company. Again, I'm so old, we didn't call it SaaS. We called it a subscription model back in the day.
But old cloud. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you might remember that acronym didn't even exist. But honestly, I didn't lose my job. I quit my job. The company I was working for, there was unethical business practices going on, and I got disillusioned by that very quickly. And so when I decided to leave that organization as a buyer, I made the decision that I wasn't looking for a job. I was looking for a company, because I never wanted to have that situation happen again, where I was working for people who didn't fit my value system, my character, and my integrity. And so first and foremost, I was vetting them for that. And I didn't necessarily really care what they did at that point. I just wanted to know that I was going to work for a high quality company with high quality employees and a high quality boss, that I didn't have to worry about being asked to do unethical or even illegal things, which is the situation I had come from. And so I literally, my husband at the time was a private baseball instructor, and the majority of the kids he worked with, the parents, the fathers, owned their own businesses. And so I started prospecting his client list and talking to them and just having lunch or breakfast with them and handing them, again, back in the day, I was handing out paper resumes and saying, hey, this is kind of what I'm looking for. And I said, you belong to golf clubs and country clubs, and you're golfing and you're doing all these things, and you probably spend your time with other business owners. Here's my skill set. I didn't come in saying I wanted to be a VP of sales. I did not know any of those titles at the time, but I did say, here's what I've learned in retail. I have strong analytical skills. I have strong financial acumen, very strong financial acumen. I'm a problem solver. It's what I do all day long. I negotiate with vendors in New York all day long. I've got good negotiation skills. So I identified my skill set, what my sales superpowers might have been. And then I said, who could use me, right? who could use somebody like me with my skill set? I didn't really know. And so one of the gentlemen that I had lunch with, like over the course of a couple of months, he offered me a position as an HR manager, which I laughed at. I said, you don't obviously know me well enough yet. You don't want me doing that. People will quit. And so I said, that's not like, I'm not a people person like that. Like that's not my forte. So we continued to talk, and he made me an offer. He and a business partner had parted ways, and he needed someone with business acumen who was a little bit older than the average age of his staff at the time to come in and not partner with him necessarily, but like take over a lot of the responsibilities that the partner had. Again, when you get a co-founder or you get a partner, everybody's got strengths and you're trying to match those for one whole person, right? So he knew what his weaknesses were and was looking for strengths, and he thought my skill set fit that. And so that's how I got into SaaS sales. And I spent 10 years going from really following him around. He called me the operations manager originally, and I was like, okay. And then, 8 months later, he asked me to hire and train a new set of salespeople. And I said, okay. And then a year after that, he said, I think I want you to run the whole sales team. And I said, okay. And then a year after that, he said, I wanted me to run the account management team, which we didn't call customer success at the time. And by the end of year 3, I was responsible for the entire revenue stream.
Right. And how did that feel from being in a position where you were sort of, like you say, you were going to be in a HR role initially to then sort of being the CRO basically for that business was quite a step up.
It was a big step up, and I didn't know anything. Like I really had never worked obviously in technology. I just knew textiles. I didn't know technology. And so one of the first things I did was reach out to a guy that I had met through a friend who was a recruiter. He owned his own staffing company. And I reached out to him. I said, I don't know what the heck I'm doing, and I need help. And he goes, how can I help? And I said, I need to talk to other people like me who've been doing this longer than I've been doing it. But very specifically, like I wanted it with my ICP. Like I wanted sales leaders working for small privately owned companies with, sales teams fewer than 10 people, like, revenue under 10 million. Like I wanted it to look just like me. And so he threw me about 6 or 7 or 8 names. And 6 of those people signed on and said, this is a great idea. And so we called it the Sales Manager Roundtable Group. And we met every month at a different location, at a different business. And we helped solve each other's problems every month. And I'm still in contact with 3 of the 6 people today. That was 25 years ago. I started the Sales Manager Roundtable Group. And we somebody walked in one day and said, I have my first maternity leave of a commission sales rep. What do we do? We were like, we don't know, but we'll figure it out before we leave today. Like we just fixed problems. We just brought problems to the table. We solved each other's problems. And when we solved them, we knew we were solving a future problem that we would have too. So it was on the job training for sure, James. It was definitely, get your life vest on and hope to float.
I love that idea. I mean, 25 years ago, but the idea of a sales manager round table and that sort of network of people together. I remember, I'm a big fan of, Mr. Beast. And I remember him talking about how his, when he was building his YouTube channel, he used to literally get on call with other YouTubers and say they dissect, thumbnails and videos and how they were going to get, solve problems. And it's such a great way to learn, isn't it? If you've got 6 or 7 other people very similar to you, there's no problem you can't solve, really.
No, and we all either were going to have that problem or already had that problem. I mean, that's why I was so specific about interviewing people that looked just like me, because then I knew that we would all have the same problems.
And amazing. I mean, so obviously, conscious of time today, and there's lots of things. I'm intrigued to know about your best ever sale. The sale that when you think about it, that comes to mind that makes you think, wow, that was my best ever sale. And what made it so special for you? If you can think, you've sold millions of pounds and dollars of sales worth over the years, but is there one that sticks out to you?
Yep, there is. When I was my last W-2 job, I was the leader of the SDR team. I had 13 SDRs underneath me. And we had gone to our weekly sales meeting. And when I came back to my desk, there was a voicemail on my phone. This was the first time I learned that when every phone and when you call in and you push 1 for sales and nobody answers, it lands in my voicemail. So I had a prospect on the phone. I listened to his voicemail. I got on the internet. I figured out he was actually local here in St. Louis. I got on the internet. I looked his company up. I looked him up. I looked his company up. I kind of poked around a little bit. And I thought, before I just forward this message off to a sales rep, I'm just going to call him. I wasn't sure he was actually ICP. So I didn't want to waste anybody's time. So I picked up the phone and did it myself, which you should be doing as a sales leader anyway. Occasionally you should be taking some sales calls. And so I got on the phone with this man, Dave, and I heard his story. I asked a bunch of questions. And then I said to him, I don't think you're ready for us yet. And he said, oh. And I said, yeah. I said, we've got a pretty complex product. And there are a couple of vendors out there that maybe you should try first that aren't as complex as we are. And I gave him the names of our competitors. And I said, I think if you're going to do it, this is where you should start. But I said, I think until you've got like, because he was a customer success software platform. I said, and he had 3 customer success reps. And I said, until you've got like 6 and a full-time customer success leader, I don't think our platform makes sense for you. And so he disappeared. And then within a few months, I'd lost my job and was out and had started my consulting business. And this man landed in my inbox in LinkedIn. I did not know his name. I did not know who he was. He did not sound familiar to me. And so he came in over the weekend. So on Monday, I reached back out to him and scheduled a call. And I got on the phone with him and I said, hey, I'm like, you seem to know who I am, but I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know who you are. And he said, and then he started to tell me the story. And because he was the only guy I ever called back and the only guy, and he said, and the only guy I'd ever talked to in that manner, I knew exactly who he was at that point. I go, oh, I know exactly who you are. I said, I'm surprised that you've been following my journey and that you knew I was now consulting. And he said, oh no, you were very memorable. And I said, well, what made me so memorable? He said, no one had ever told me no before. No one had ever refused to sell me anything. And that's when I knew that doing the right things made the right things happen. I spent a year helping his sales team. His sales leader was on a PIP plan when I came in. And I spent about 6 weeks doing an evaluation and then doing executive coaching with the VP and some sales training with the sales team. I spent a year in total. I then ended up helping their customer success team, which is why he called originally. I spent a year and they became my largest client that year.
I mean, amazing. And it's a great story because it does go to show, and it goes back to the element of, it's that great Maya Angelou quote, I always think, which people will forget what you told them, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And it's those elements that he's obviously, like you say, you became memorable because you were brave enough to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right for you. And it goes back to what you said at the start, your big lesson about what people get wrong. They think everyone's a fit. And it's such a good point. And it's a point that I talk to a lot of the teams that I coach and mentor with. I always go the other way. I'd call it go the other way. Hey, look, even just in an initial conversation, I'm going to have a chat to you today. And if it turns out we're not a good fit, hey, that's okay. We've only lost 30 minutes of time. Oh. And I call it the release valve, because then the buyer's then thinking, okay, you're not going to push down my throat. They go, oh, well, I'm happy to share more information with you. But so few salespeople seem to want to do it.
Yeah, I think I truly just believe the universe takes care of me, right? As long as I'm doing the right thing. And I think people know the difference between right and wrong. They just sometimes aren't willing or disciplined to do the right thing all the time, because sometimes the right thing is scary, right? I mean, if my boss had walked in, if the CEO had walked into my office as I was sending this guy over to Tatango, I might have been fired on the spot, right? He might have been like, what are you doing sending them to our number one competitor? I'm like, they're not ready. Like, I just knew they weren't ready. Right. So, but that came, when that came back to me, and that was my first year in business. At the end of my first year of business, he was my major client, my second year in business. And that means he'd been following me for 18 or more months, just quietly waiting for his opportunity to strike. Right. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I was like, it really did reinforce. I knew intuitively that doing those things was the right thing to do, because that's how I was raised, right? I was raised in an ethical, family, those ethical situations. And so I knew it was the right thing to do. And so I wasn't like debating whether it was the right thing to do. I just did what I would normally have done. But then I realized that, doing the right things, like, you will be rewarded, maybe not in the moment, right? We didn't get the sale. I didn't get that sale from him. I didn't sell him something he didn't need and was able to check the box and, pat myself on the back. Like, I sold something to somebody. No, I would have sold something to somebody who didn't need it or would have failed. In general, I was more concerned that they would fail during onboarding and implementation, because then they would freak out because it was so complex. So yeah, and again, like, I often do this. I mean, I say the same thing. I've got a line just like you kind of got a line. And I say to my prospects, hey, listen, my brother loves me, but he affectionately says, I'm not for everyone. And so that release valve, I give them the opportunity. I have a very direct communication style. If the baby's ugly and there's not a bow big enough or pink enough to make it not ugly, that's pretty much what's going to come out of my mouth. If you're not prepared for that, or that's not a communication style that you think will work well with you or your team, I'm pretty upfront about that, because I don't want to get into a situation. My entire business comes from referrals, 100%. I don't want to get in a situation where someone brings me on board and is like, she was brash and, aggressive and mean and whatever. No, I'm realistic and I'm honest. And sometimes that's uncomfortable.
It is, and it's such a great point you make. I talk a lot about. I also think as well, because it's the impact on the business. And when in my software business that I had, when we had salespeople that brought in, I used to call it, excuse the phrase, it's a bit of a, but you'll expect like this being. I used to call them hot curry customers, right? Because they taste okay, but they hurt like hell the other end. And the reality is that you don't want customers like that who are then going to create problems. And I call them BMWs, bitches, moaners, and whiners, who are then going to create problems the other end, right? Where they then moaning that the system is too much or the value's not there and whatever. Have the courage to say, like you just said, we're not right for you. And by the way, here's why. Go and because that customer will come back to you in time, but they'll also respect you more for it. They'll also go and they'll respect the brand and the company. So when they are ready to go, they'll go back to you because if you said that.
Yeah.
No, it's such a good point. Such a good point. Look, so I want to talk about, coach of time, and I'll talk about the book in a moment, but I want to talk about the billboard first. Tell me about the billboard. How the hell did the billboard happen? So you had a billboard with your name on in your. Talk to us a little bit about how that came about for quickly. I was.
Yep, I'm going to let out a big secret. My publisher, the book publisher, arranged this for me. But those billboards in Times Square and on NASDAQ are pay to play. So I paid money to get my, to have my picture taken and then have it show up on the billboard. So I had my picture taken, and then I flew to New York so I could have my picture taken in front of my picture. I think it was fun, right? I don't think it brought me any business. I just think it's fun. I think it's like the coffee table book, right? It's just something to talk about with people. And it was a blast. Like I had, I'd spent a lot of time in New York because of the buyer situation at the department store. So New York is very familiar to me, and I would stay in Times Square. So I was very comfortable there, but it was like a really fun trip. I mean, it was kind of like the icing on top of the cake and the cherry on top, because I worked really hard to write that book. It took 2 years, and it was just fun to celebrate it.
I should imagine. And so let's talk about the book a bit then. So selling your way in, if for those that, if you haven't read it, who should read it? And you said you're a direct person and you're very much about who is a good, who should read it and who shouldn't read it?
People who don't want to do their own work should not read it. So people who are looking for a hack, a quick hit, or a step-by-step instruction guide should not read it. I did not write a how-to book. I wrote a book for sales professionals, leaders, and individual contributors to help them pick the right jobs for them, the right sales roles, selling the right thing in the right industry with the right company and the right sales leader. Because I truly believe that the majority of people are struggling to get to the top 10% because they picked the wrong sales role. And maybe because they don't know themselves well enough, or maybe because that was the one that presented itself. But maybe you shouldn't be selling into healthcare. Maybe you should be selling into the manufacturing industry, or maybe you should be selling into childcare centers. Maybe you should be selling to HR versus selling into IT. I don't think people take enough time to think about that. So I wrote an entire book on how to really identify your sales superpowers, your sales secret weapons, how you like to be compensated, how you like to be rewarded, what kind of life do you want to lead? Because I believe that sales is one of the only professions on the planet where you can actually control your income. So you get to decide the kind of life you want based on the amount of money you want to make, how hard you want to work, what kind of what kind of selling you want to do. And so I think most people, it's so funny. I say we're very proactive about our prospecting, right? We understand our ICP and our persona. We pick our target accounts. We would never pick someone who wasn't a target account. And we go out there and we very proactively and intentionally prospect people that we think are perfect for our product or service. And then we take a job because a recruiter called and said, boy, do I have a deal for you. And I'm like, what? Very reactive. Most salespeople are very reactive about their career. And it doesn't make any sense to me because we spend all of our time being more proactive. And so, and then people wonder why they're struggling and they're not successful. And I'm like, because you didn't vet the company to the extent you vet a prospect.
It's and it's a real great golden nugget and it's interesting because for a client of mine that I've got, I'm doing an interview for a sales director for them, and they've asked me to come in because they wanted someone to give a different opinion. And it was such a great point because you make there, and I'm intrigued to hear if there's one great question I should ask them when I'm interviewing as to how they can define that. Because for me, it's it's the same as sales, actually. People think sales is subservience. It isn't. Sales is a two-way relationship between two people that want to come together, that form a bond because there's a buyer and a seller, and a seller, requirements to meet. And I think the same with the company. And it's intriguing, isn't it, that a lot of people jump at the first opportunity without sort of knowing whether it's the right fit for them. So, there you go. Here's a question. What's a question that if someone's listening to this as a leader that they can ask someone, that maybe they're for a sales rep or even a senior sales role that could maybe help them sort of define what you've just talked about there, to see whether that person is a good fit and to know whether they've done the work to see if they're a good fit?
Yeah, I have two questions. One, I put on me as the leader. So I have a two-way interview process, but the first half of it is all about me figuring out if I think you're a good fit for us. Right. And one of the first questions I ask is like, this is sort of how we do things, right? We have a 5-stage sales process. We're B2B SaaS. So in general, like, again, I'm not going to ever try to fit a square peg into a round hole. So I'm looking for B2B sellers, right? B2B SaaS sellers first and foremost. So if you've been selling John Deere tractors or widgets or copper, I'm not even going to talk to you, right? Because I know that the chances of you being successful here are slim. And it's not worth, it's a much more bigger lift, harder effort for me. So the first thing I say to them is like, let me tell you a little bit about how we do things. And then I want you to pick the sales job and walk me through the sales process that you think most closely mirrors mine. Because again, it'll be easier for them to onboard and be successful. It'll be easier for me to onboard them and train them. And so why would I want to pick somebody whose sales process is so different than what I'm doing currently and have to retrain them? And so that's the first question I ask, is for me to try to figure that out. And then the other thing I ask is like, I ask them about their sales superpower. I'm like, what do you think you do better than your coworkers and your competition that give you a leg up? I need to know if they understand what their special powers are.
Great question. And it's interesting, isn't it, the answer? Because many people are afraid of coming across as arrogant, but if you don't know that, then it's actually a big risk for the employer and also, like you say, for the person that's going into that role. Because all you're going to do is add another CV to your list or another company to your list, and suddenly you become a flitting person that no one wants to hire. So it's actually important for both sides, as you say.
Yep.
So talk to me about. So obviously, Mike wrote the forward for the book. How did you get that to happen? And his books are obviously a great inspiration to many salespeople worldwide, as I'm sure yours will are as well. But how did that come about? And for those who don't know Mike, I'm sure I'd love to get him on the podcast. He's a Sales Simplified was a great book, I think, in terms of sort of what he put together. So how did that happen?
Ironically, when I was starting my consulting business, he was consulting for a company who was looking for a VP of sales. And so as I was out there, when knew I was going to be losing my job, I went out to just find another W-2 sales leadership position. But the universe conspired to put me into this consulting situation and starting my own business. And I was in the process of interviewing with a fintech company. And so I had all of a sudden, like, I had 2 clients, like 2 consulting clients, and I knew I was not going to take a full-time job with this company. And so I called the owner. It was a husband and wife team. And I called the husband and said, hey, can I come in and talk to you guys? And so we came in and I said, hey, things have changed for me and I am going to start a consulting business. And I think you should be a client. You have 2 AEs and 1 SDR. I don't think you need a full-time sales leader. I think you need a fractional sales leader. And I think I should help you. And they said, no, thank you. We really want a full-time sales leader. And I said, that's fine. And then a week later, the husband called me and he said, hey, I've been thinking about your offer and I'd like you to talk to somebody that we've been working with. And I said, sure, who you been working with? And he said, Mike Weinberg. And I said, the Mike Weinberg? Because I'd been using Mike's book, New Sales Simplified, as book club book when I was training sales teams. And I was like, and I knew he lived in St. Louis. I just never met him. And so he was like, yeah, would you have breakfast with him? And I'm like, uh-huh. And so I had breakfast with Mike, and he said we were siblings from another mother. We both believed in, picking up the phone and making calls and all that stuff. And so at the end of that, he said, I think this is a perfect idea. And I said, well, remember, like they were looking for a full-time sales leader. I don't know that this is going to work out. And he said, leave it to me. I'll take care of it. And I said, okay. And sure enough, 2 days later, the owner called and I came in and we hammered out the details. And then Mike, who also has a superpower of generosity, offered to mentor me for the first year. He called me regularly, checked in with me. He gave me his contract. He helped me set pricing. He was there every time I picked up the phone. If you think he travels a lot now, wait till back in the day, he was traveling a lot more than he travels today. But he would call me from Boston, or he would check in with me here and check in with me there. And we just developed this relationship. And then when I started to write a book, I reached out to him to get some advice. And he kind of, coached me through some of that. When I was deciding whether to self-publish or get a publisher, he coached me through that. And so finally I just asked, I'm like, will you write the foreword for my book? And he said, yes. And so I sent him, the first section was done. So I sent him the first section, and then he called me back and said, that's an absolute yes. He's like, you've written a different book. You haven't written a how-to. You haven't written a book that's out there on the market. I think this is really unique, and it would be my pleasure to write the foreword.
Fantastic. Look, he's a great sales inspiration for so many people, around the world. So the fact that he's there, and look, and what I'm going to do as well, and I'll do this actually. So anyone, the first person that connects actually from when we put the pod, we'll share this on LinkedIn as a podcast, and the first person that reaches, in fact, we'll do two. The first person, two people that reach out, we'll get them a copy of your book, and we'll also get them a copy of Mike's, because his book is a great read from a sales perspective as well, in terms of as well as yours. So we'll look to do that. So look, it's been brilliant to chat to you. I'm conscious of time. I know you've got a busy schedule today, and you've got lots going on. But final thoughts from you? Is there anything? If anyone's listening to this and they're thinking, okay, Kristie, is there anything else you want to impress on me in terms of my sales journey? Maybe they're starting in sales, maybe they're midway through their career, maybe towards the end of their career. Is there any final words from you that you'd say, right, actually, this is, just make sure you do the following?
Yeah. Sales is really hard, right? It's a high rejection sport. And so I say that I think another thing that we don't talk enough about is the mental side of sales. So, your circle matters. Make sure you're surrounding yourself with people who are going to go on the journey with you and not try to disrupt your journey. People that are also looking to get into sales or trying to move up the sales ladder, who have ambitions or desires to, have a better life for themselves and their kids, or have a second home, or pay cash for college. Make sure that you're surrounding yourself with like-minded people that will support you along the way. And then, you have to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Are you eating right? Are you exercising? Are you getting enough sleep? Do you have a religious or spiritual practice? It really is sales takes a lot out of you. There's a lot of rejection. There's a lot of disappointment. It is not an easy job. And if you're not, you need to think of yourself like a high performance athlete, right? Who wouldn't be out at the clubs the night before the big game, who wouldn't be putting hamburger and fries in their body before the big game, who wouldn't be going without sleep before the big game. The top athletes in the world. And by the way, the majority of top CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies start their day in the gym, right? That's not a secret. That's not a secret, and it's not a surprise, right? They understand that they can't be the best for themselves and others if they are not taking care of themselves. Everything starts here internally. So I would say, ask yourself, not just because you want to live 10 years longer, but you might want to live 10 years longer. Think about this though. If you're not taking care of yourself and you shorten your life by 10 years, think about the income that also shortens for you. I was just talking to somebody earlier today, Val Kilmer just died at 65. At 65. And he had cancer, which actually took him out of the game. If he had not been a top performer prior to getting throat cancer and having that completely derailed his professional career. But he had been a top performer, doing all the right things, taking care of himself. Top Gun is just one example of how he physically took care of himself. But he was able to get to the top of his game. And so when the unexpected happened, and what he probably thought was one of the worst things that could happen to an actor, having throat cancer, yes, I'm sure that was terribly disappointing. But he didn't have to worry about how he's going to pay his mortgage.
Yeah, it's a great point. As a great phrase I always use, which is the body's the business. And the reality is, if you're not in a position to to do the things you need to do, and you can't, like you say, you haven't got the right amount of energy to get through the day and to withstand the ups and downs. Sales the roller coaster, right? So if you haven't got those elements in place, you're going to struggle. So look, we could talk all night. So many insights you've got and insights around things, but look, we're going to give people, as I say, the first two people to reach out on, we're going to share the podcast on LinkedIn, which is where I'm guessing where most people can connect with you. Obviously they can buy the book on Amazon, and if they go to your website, I know your website is a great place for them to have access to buy the book, and people can connect with you on LinkedIn, I'm guessing, as well. Is there any other ways in which you people can reach out to find you? I know you're on lots of different social channels as well.
Yeah, I sure am. I would love people. What I ask for is connect with me on LinkedIn and send me a note and tell me the one takeaway you had from today's conversation. That would make me really happy.
Love that. Well, I think that's a great thing for them to do, especially if they want to copy the book. They need to make sure that they're doing that. So, look, Kristie, thank you so much for your time. You've been incredibly generous with your time to share your insights and knowledge with everyone and the listeners. It's going to be really powerful to so many people to have some. And I always say this: I don't have, and I've said this when I interviewed Melina Palmer. I don't have enough ladies and inspirational women on my podcast, and that's something that I think is really important, because for me, my team is full of fantastic ladies that work with me, and I'm always trying to help more. I personally don't think there's the salespeople I know that the ladies are great at what they do. They've got a real different sense of emotional engagement with prospects. I think it's incredibly inspiring that you're here to help, and hopefully you're helping inspire lots of other people to have a great career in sales as well. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I've had a great chat.
Oh, no worries at all. Well, look, great to see you, and look, have a great rest of the day. And as I say, we'll make sure get yourself a copy of Selling Your Way In. It's a book that's going to change your career and change your life. So, which is great. So thanks very much. That was Kristie Jones on the podcast. Thank you so much, guys, for listening. As ever, it's great to share some insights with you, and really appreciate your ears. So we'll see you next week for another episode. But until then, stay safe and keep selling well. Take care.